with that. Here we go.
Woohoo! Let's go, Maya.
Yeah. Well, oh yeah!
Oh my God! Look at that!
Here's my dancing shoes.
Here comes Maya. Here she comes. On the backwards. Look at her. See? And Judy. Okay. Oh yeah.
Great. Good morning, Timothy, once again.
That seemed like a recording from one of our earlier episodes.
It did, didn't it? Well, it is nice to have it. I didn't realize it was a recording, actually. It could have been. So, and I suddenly lost you, Timothy. Are you still in the studio? Maybe not. Oh, wow. Okay, hopefully you're coming back. Let's see how much
There
time
we go.
it will. Okay, great. Happy to have you back. Yes. Okay. Good morning. Thank you for being here once again at 8:20 in the morning. There is a lot to talk about. I'm thankful to you
Thank you.
about yes, being here once again. I don't want to keep anybody waiting, so let's dive directly into the briefing, and after that, we'll continue with the questions and answers on Clubhouse.
Thank you, Maya. Let's hit it right away. Today is May 14th, 2023. Today is episode 118. Congratulations, Maya. We're on a real roll, and we're not the only ones. Japan is a hotbed of activity, and the foreign minister is really on a roll as well. G7 is going to start later this week on the 19th. So there's a lot of activity going on to that. The ministerial meetings, as you know, in leading up to the Hiroshima summit, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of this week, there are ministerial meetings all over the country, 23 of them in total. And these are really big deals. Typically, the ministers of state or the minister of agriculture, the minister of foreign affairs, that sort of thing, gets together with their colleagues in at least the G7. There are other countries that are invited as observers and also as participants. So it includes more than G7. But the communiques coming out of those tell you an awful lot. So you can look at and download some of these communiques that are published. They are the foundation for what's going to happen in Hiroshima later this week. But boy, it's been an active last 2 months. So even just this last week, there was the education ministerial and the digital ministerial last week. We reported a bit on that. But these have been going on in Toyama, Kanazawa, Yamazaki Prefecture, Niigata, Sendai, Toyama, Sapporo, all over the country. And this is a real boom for economic activity going in, because they take up all of the big hotels and the taxis and all of the delivery services. So it is a shot in the arm. And on top of that, with Golden Week, the Golden Week numbers are starting to flow in. It was a boom year over the last 4. It was one of the greatest, as you would have expected. And just an incredible increase in the number of foreigners who have come into Japan over the Golden Week period and even before that. So although the economy is suffering from a lot of just things that are going on with the high costs and the inflation and the energy costs, a lot of things are happening right now. So what we talk about frequently on this program is what's going on with Mr. Kishida. Is he going to call for a snap election? Remember, we were talking about that quite actively maybe a month ago, 2 months ago. Then we had the elections, and the elections have put a little bit of a damper on that speculation. But let me go through a couple of the hot issues that are going on right now in Japanese politics and in Japanese policy. Some of these things are precursors to what's going to be happening in policy. Some of them are outgrowths of policies that have been implemented and that are being kind of rolled out now. So let me go into a couple of those now before I get into some of the details of the nitty-gritty of what's going on with Mr. Kishida, what's going on within LDP factions, what's going on with the economy. So as I said, Foreign Minister Hayashi is on a tear. He is in Sweden. He hit Sweden yesterday. They are having, strangely enough, in Helsinki, the Indo-Pacific Ministerial. So this is consisting of trade ministers from all over the globe, joining in Helsinki for a large conclave on what's going on with trade and defense and all of these things that are consistent with the U.S. policy and how we're going to have like-minded countries joining together to face this potential onslaught by China and also by North Korea. So he is meeting with his counterparts from Finland, Austria, Latvia, and a host of other countries. He'll be there until today, later today, and then fly back tomorrow. So this next week is going to be very busy, as it's been busy for the last 2 months. Kishida just came back from, Prime Minister Kishida just came back from South Korea. This time last week, he left on Saturday. He came back on Monday. So it was a great trip. It was great in building this relationship between South Korea and Japan. It is one of the linchpins of this like-minded countries being formed here. Japan holds a center position there, and without South Korea in some form of a shared feeling of what we're going to be doing together, it really is something of an empty promise to have this kind of coalition of like-minded countries. So a lot of effort has been put into that, and I'll be getting into that a little bit later in more detail. Did you know COVID is over? We talked about this last week. The Japanese government has announced the relaxing of restrictions, so people who are coming in from the airports don't have to have their COVID card. They don't have to show that they've been inoculated several times. The masks have mask restrictions have fallen, so you see a lot of people on the streets and in restaurants and that sort of thing. So it's becoming very light and airy, and with the boom to the economy, things are beginning to be upbeat. And I think it's upbeat before it will be downbeat, because we've got a lot of things coming down the path. And I think before, you have to pay the piper, there's more likely a chance that the prime minister will have an election, because he's got to explain to the Japanese people how he's going to pay for the defense budget of 4 trillion additional each year, and 1 trillion of that is going to come from you, the taxpayers, and that's not a good message to be sending. It's been telegraphed, it's been discussed, it hasn't been established yet, and I think before it becomes firm, there's likely to be an election, not a snap election, an election called by the prime minister. It's called a snap election, but I think people will be well prepared for it when it does happen. And in addition, he's talking about the declining birth rate and the unprecedented actions he's going to take to boost the birth rate. Unprecedented is a big word, and there has been a lot of things unprecedented in the last 2 or 3 years under COVID. For example, the supplemental budgets and the national budgets which were produced over the last 2 years were at unprecedented levels as well. So there's a lot of that going on, and there's a lot of money going out, not represented by so much money coming in. And that's something that's going on with the United States as well, and the reason why President Joe Biden is having a little bit of difficulty with the Congress there. Time Magazine, Time Magazine is famous for identifying the person of the year. In their latest article, they've come out with a couple of news. Number one, if Time Magazine has diminished or closed out their paywall policy, so you can access their documents and the entire magazine without going through a paywall. And it's indicative of what's going on throughout the internet economy, that people who are trying to generate revenue by selling information and services and articles, that's beginning to diminish. People are not paying into that. There have been a couple of failures of companies who have depended on that revenue stream. So the fact that Time has kind of dropped that requirement too is somewhat suggestive. But also they're known for having the Man of the Year, and they just did a special on Prime Minister Kishida, an extensive interview. He's actually had a couple of those. He had a big one in the Japan Times as well, an exclusive interview, which he hasn't done for quite a while. So it's not that he's coming out, but globally, he is really beginning to put on the afterburners of portraying himself as a global leader. The Times article did kind of overstep, I think. They upset the foreign ministry by stating that Japan is going to be a superpower, a military superpower, in order to be the vanguard of this collection of like-minded countries against a potential Chinese threat on Taiwan. That wording was not very well tuned to the ears of the foreign ministry, and there was a little bit of controversy going on there. I think they've tweaked it back a little bit. The projection is not that they want Japan to be perceived as a military superpower because of the echoes from the recent past and the Pacific War, but it is inevitable that Japan is going to be emerging. It's going to be the third largest military power in the world, with the infusion of the GDP going from 1% to 2% devoted to military spending. So in terms of offensive capabilities, it is still toying with that idea. I think it's inevitable that they have dual use programs that are going to be promoting them. But in terms of just offensive first strike, those sort of capabilities, I think that they are going to, like South Korea has agreed to, relinquish that role to the United States. So if you've been following the news, President Yoon visited Joe Biden. He had an extensive 5-day trip to the United States. He made a really big impact and a very good impression. But one of the things that they decided was, although we rattled the sabers a little bit to kind of get the United States more actively engaged with us, and we said maybe, if the United States isn't going to pony up, then South Korea should be producing nuclear weapons on its own. The United States came back and said, no, we will take care of that part of it. And I think probably that's the role of the United States with regard to Japan too. Japan will focus on defensive capabilities, on supply and support for allies in the region, and maybe dual use. But with the defense industry in such an infant stage as it is here in Japan, it needs to be developed up. That's going to take 10 or 20 years. I think that is on schedule, but it's just we're only now getting comfortable with that, and with the idea that Japan's budget will be 2% of it devoted to military spending. So without getting indigestion, I think this is just one of the things that will be coming up. Joe Biden also sent a signal that perhaps, he's a little bit busy and maybe he won't be joining G7. He said that on Wednesday. It caused a huge uproar. The foreign ministry, of course, said, look, if Biden doesn't come, that means it's not a G7. He's got to come. So there was a lot of back and forth there. He backstepped it a little bit and said, yes, it's not that I will be there virtually. I will actually be there physically. They made a press release on that the following day. It caused such an uproar. But it is somewhat upsetting that just before the summit, of which the United States is a key player, to not have the president also showing up, it's really shaking in one's confidence. So I'm pretty confident that he will show up, that the debt ceiling negotiations with Representative McCarthy, or Speaker of the House McCarthy, will either be delayed, pushed off, or resolved before he leaves. But he's going to be leaving, I believe, on Thursday, get here on Thursday, and then it would be Friday, Saturday, and Sunday that he would be here. And he leaves. It does not look like he will be visiting Nagasaki, which was originally promoted. Would have been a big deal for nuclear nonproliferation, but I think the president is just he needs to kind of limit his activities and conserve his strength. He will be going to the South Pacific Islands immediately after the G7, so that's a big deal for this coalition of forces that the United States is trying to build. There were a couple of earthquakes this last week, just one in Chiba that woke everybody up, a 4.1 in Chiba. It was probably around a 3.5 here in Tokyo. That woke people up. And then there was another one in Ishikawa, across to the Japan seaside. That was a larger one, 6.5. And then just yesterday or Friday, there was another one in Kagoshima. So it's not really a swarm because they're not typically interrelated. It's not on the same plate, but it is unsettling when these kinds of things happen in such quick succession. So we're keeping an eye on that. Komeito, the party who is in coalition with the LDP in defining Japanese policy and the government, is beginning to feel a little bit uneasy and nervous about their situation on the results of the election that we just finished 2 weeks ago. So Ishin is coming up, Komeito is coming down. It seems like it is a coalition party whose relationship with the LDP is not as strong or not as vibrant as it once was. The responsibility for that is the Secretary General, that is Mr. Motegi right now. The earlier Secretary General was Mr. Nikai, who had a good relationship with Komeito and also Prime Minister Abe, Mr. Suga as well. But the current administration under Mr. Kishida with Mr. Motegi as the Secretary General doesn't have the depth and the richness of the relationship. So there's a little bit of love that's being felt like it's lost, and the election results also relate that. And I'd like to get into that a little bit more, but I just want to touch on that. There's also worrying news about the weather and El Nino approaching. This always creates devastation with rain and drought and high temperatures, and that is beginning to show itself now. So in light of everything else that's going on with Ukraine, and Ukraine being the breadbasket of the world, being kind of on hold now, and El Nino approaching, and the rise in prices for fertilizers, and just a lot of the food shortages that are going on globally, El Nino coming at a particularly unattractive time is concerning and worrying to policymakers all over the world, and especially Japan. Japan has about a 38% self-sufficiency rate in food. Most of the food needs to be produced. It can't be produced by just natural sources. It needs, because there's such a high demand on it, it needs fertilizers to produce the kind of yield that is required. Even with that, producing about 38% of their self-sufficiency, they need to import fertilizers. Fertilizers typically come from petroleum, so there's a lot of concern there about food sufficiency and what's coming down the path. So it's not really a very optimistic approach that is coming over the next maybe 8 months or so. The South Korea has decided, in addition to all of the other things that they decided when Yoon and Kishida met this last week, and they did achieve quite a bit on sharing security, military information, and also restarting this shuttle diplomacy. And there are a lot of other things that are going on in addition to that, taking them off, putting them back onto the most favored trade partner relationship, so that a lot of the things that Japan was producing that were withheld from South Korea because of the tense relationships have been released. But one of the agreements that was reached while Mr. Kishida was in South Korea was that South Korea will send a delegation to Fukushima to test the waters and to get a little bit more information. Be careful what you wish for, because sometimes these things don't produce the result that you want, and this might likely be one. So there will be a high-powered nuclear delegation coming to Japan to observe and test and kind of analyze what the release of the waters into the Pacific is going to look like. And that is going to produce a bit of a backlash. It's expected to produce a little bit of a backlash. And also the International Energy Organization was also in town, talking about how Japan is going to recycle the soil, contaminated soil. So that was in the news just this last week about getting other people involved in what Japan is going to do. Japan can't decide these things by itself. It's such a big issue and a costly issue. So there was a big delegation in town talking about that. Japan needs to move very carefully and collaboratively, and it's pretty much in a box in doing that. There has been a little bit of progress on the legislation for LGBTQ plus, but I think it is not as satisfactory as the proponents want it, even though of all the G7 countries, Japan is way behind in acknowledging same-sex non-discrimination and acknowledging, for example, living arrangements or marriages. So they had a meeting this last week. The LDP did acquiesce on some issues, but it's still probably not satisfactory. But the bill that they did satisfy will go up for passage just in time for G7. It's not just G7 where Japan is a laggard, but there have been reports from the Organization of Economic Developed Countries that Japan is probably number 34 of the 35 countries in terms of acknowledging same-sex and non-discrimination towards sexual minorities, in addition to, in the same report, talking about the participation of women in the economy and in politics in general. I'll get into that a little bit more later in the briefing. The Constitutional Democratic Party, following in the footsteps of Ishin's Mr. Baba, also said, if we don't win 600 seats in this last election, then I will resign, and they won more than that. So Kenta Izumi, the leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, announced just this last week that if we don't win 150 seats, should there be another election, a lower house election, then I will resign. So kind of pumping adrenaline into his voter base and into his party. So to get the excitement there, there's been a couple of news reports coming out and a nice analysis of what is the state of Japanese democracy that analyzes the last voting trends. And so it is building for a fight. So if one of the things you're looking at as an important stepping stone is the snap election and what the prime minister is going to do, it is all building up with these little tidbits that I'm feeding you throughout this briefing and all of the other briefings. We've also noticed a bit of slippage in the My Number. My Number is an issue that's promoted by the Secretary General Motegi. He is the one that helped initiate it when he was Minister of, Minister of Economic Development, I believe. And he was one of the proponents of My Number and goosing My Number so that it includes lots of other additional features, not just insurance payments and bank records and identification, that sort of thing. So it is a worrying development that over this last week, there have been a couple of reports where people have put in their My Number, they've asked for documents and received somebody else's documents, or somehow it's been kind of changed out. So this is a big deal because the Japanese government has put a lot of money and a lot of effort into this universal system. It's kind of like your Social Security system that you might have in other countries, including the United States. So it's a one number that it attaches to each individual. And when there's problems in the technical part of it, I mean, even Mr. Taro Kono, Minister of the Digital Agency, shut down the operations of My Number for a brief period so that they could address that. So that's a big issue policy-wise and also in terms of just government. You might have noticed I don't know if it's an uptick in crimes in Japan, but there have been a couple of remarkable crimes that have happened over the last 10 days. One was a murder by a junior high school teacher of a person in his neighborhood, and it went kind of quiet for a while. The individual was stabbed and died in his doorway, and the police didn't make an arrest until just this last week, and the individual they arrested was a well-mannered, highly regarded junior high school teacher who apparently, the story is that they've arrested him now and they're working through his alibis, was just kind of strapped for money and thought that he would knock somebody's house off, and it turned out that there was somebody there, and they got into altercation. He unfortunately killed him and ran away. There's that. That's very rare to happen in Japan. But also this remarkable crime in Ginza, where the Rolex watch store was attacked by 4 individuals. I guess you followed that because it is it was filmed. The people were breaking glass. The 4 kids were breaking glass. It turns out that there were 5 individuals. One was 16 years old, one was 18, 2 were 19, and then there's one individual who they haven't caught yet. But in their getaway, they had 2 guys in the van, and they had more than 100 watches. They ran through Akasaka and crashed their car, and then ran in trying to escape, and they just busted into somebody's apartment and were holed up there. The police came in and captured the 4. They got maybe 30 or 40 watches. They don't know where the rest of the watches are. They don't know where the 5th individual is. But the 4 kids that were doing this didn't even know each other. They weren't a group. They weren't a criminal organization. They were kind of organized by somebody kind of like this Lupi group that was kind of terrorizing the countryside, where they would give them instructions and houses to hit, and they would rob the houses and tie up the people. And there was an old lady that was killed, and these 4 masterminds were arrested in the Philippines. We reported on that, and they were in detention running this scam out of the detention center. So this kind of technique of hiring people, giving them a job to do, and then giving them some of the spoils or paying them off as a result without anybody meeting everybody seems to be a trend that's going on. It turns out that they haven't captured who is the mastermind here. The 4 boys didn't know each other before that. They just were hired to do a job, show up here, rent the car here, that sort of thing. But it is a worrying trend. These guys, these 4 kids, usually it's high return, low risk. For these guys, it was high risk, no return. They got nothing out of it. Maybe somebody had given them a little bit of money to collect, and then they would get a payoff after a successful heist, but it didn't seem like it worked that way. So it's a worrying trend. But when you look at the overall picture, crimes in Japan actually have decreased. They've diminished since 2018, before COVID. And there are crimes that come up that, like stalking, stabbing, just random people, those kinds of things that hit the press that are very newsworthy. But actually, overall crime seems to be down. It was 51 years ago, just this last week, that Okinawa was returned to Japan. You might remember Richard Nixon agreed to return Okinawa to the Japanese homeland. And during that transition, I wasn't living. I left Okinawa in 1969, and the reversion was in 1971. But it was a massive change because at the time that the United States occupied Japan, the coin of the realm was the US dollar. There was no Japanese yen that was used there. They drove on the wrong side of the road. Everything was administered by the United States. If you were an Okinawan native and you wanted to visit the homeland, you needed a passport and you needed a visa to go to the homeland, to go to Japan proper. So that all changed in a period of about 5 months, bringing in all this Japanese yen and exchanging the US dollar. So it's a pretty big deal. Okinawa is always a point of interest and concern because of the military presence that's there and the buildup that's going on. So we continue to watch that. The smallest faction of the LDP received 1 new member this last week. It's a big deal because factions don't usually expand or contract very rapidly. But this tells you there's been a little bit of movement over the last 2 months where the Abe faction has received 3 new members, and Mr. Aso's faction received 2 members. So there's been a little bit of movement. It seems to be bracing, the LDP is bracing for something that's coming up. So change is in the air. The the largest faction, the Abe faction, is still called the Abe faction, even though Mr. Abe has been dead for almost a year. And the leader of that faction has yet to emerge by general acclaim. So I think the stage is being set for these kinds of things happening in a very big way. So it's, please continue to stay tuned to this briefing, because there's a lot going on. Let's get back to the big deals. What's going on with Mr. Kishida, and is there going to be a snap election? So there is speculation, but it's not as hot and heavy as it was before the election. And the reason for that is because the election results, when you analyze them, they reveal that Mr. Kishida and the LDP in general is not really in a very firm, positive position. So in order to call a snap election, you need some huge win to kind of boost the prime minister and convince people that he's doing a really great job. G7 is probably that brief wind. The prime minister will do extremely well. He's doing extremely well right now. His diplomatic skills are being brought to the fore. People appreciate him. People all over the world know who Mr. Kishida is. It's not somebody that they are thinking about, do I need to remember his name? Because the last prime minister lasted less than a year, Mr. Suga, and we didn't know him, and he didn't speak English very well. And Mr. Kishida is a different flavor. So it looks like his poll numbers are rising. But the results of the election, when you analyze them, the LDP did not really do as well as you might have expected. We took a close look at, in addition to the governor's races and the municipal elections and the city mayor's elections, there were 5 diet seats, 1 upper house seat and 4 lower house seats that were up for election as a by-election. That means that the person that was sitting in that seat either resigned or died or was removed from office. And of the 5, it was somewhat obvious that the LDP would win at least 4 of them. They lost one in a surprise move by Ishin because the LDP couldn't get their act together. But of the 4 that were remaining, 2 of them were like no contest because they were in Yamaguchi Prefecture, where Mr. Abe's prefecture is and where the LDP has always been strong. So in those 2 prefectures, the one where Mr. Abe's seat was vacated and he had a candidate come in, the LDP supported him, so it's an LDP candidate who won that election. In the second one, Mr. Kishi, Mr. Abe's brother, Minister of Defense, he had resigned, and his eldest son ran in his place. It's a shoo-in. He's obviously going to win. Of the remaining 2, the number of votes that the LDP won by was less than 2%. So the margins between the first place winner and the second place contender are very, very narrow. And when you take a look at the numbers of candidates in all of the prefectures, and it wasn't a nationwide race, it didn't include everybody. It was about 50% in the municipal elections and the 5 diet seats. The number of votes won by the victor is less than 1.02%. So that means that the contender only lost by a very slim margin. And that margin can be eclipsed just by a flavor of, somebody saying the wrong thing or some scandal being suggested or something happening within the political party. And so having an election under this kind of scenario is not a given. And they've done a poll. The LDP did an internal poll that said if they hold an election today, they will lose 60 members, and 60 for the lower house would make the LDP under the 50%. It already requires its coalition partner Komeito, so that it has a 50% more than 50%, 2/3 in the upper house. But in the lower house, that would be devastating. It would actually have to have a coalition partner, and with the relationship between Komeito and the LDP not being so very favorable, losing them as a coalition partner or losing 60 seats in the LDP Doesn't mean that the Komeito is going to be gaining seats. In fact, it's more suggested that the Komeito would at least lose some seats, if not be on par, but Ishin would win more seats. So the idea of having an election now is not very favorably viewed by the LDP. But there's a lot going on there. Tobias Harris is a friend and a colleague. He's in Washington, D.C. He does a lot of political observations and analysis. He produced a piece that you can Google and take a look at. It's called The State of Japanese Democracy. I think he produced it this last week. I don't want to get into the details because he lays it out so well about the attitude of Japanese voters, about the LDP, about Komeito, about the opposition parties. You know, the vast majority, it was a very successful poll that was conducted over a couple of months. And the vast majority of people who were polled, their response to a vast number of questions was, I don't know, you know, I guess. Not very many people feel strongly one way or the other. And for those people that live in Japan, you kind of understand what that is like, even on a daily basis. People are very somewhat lackadaisical in terms of political thought, but also in terms of other things, you know, shogunai and, you know, whatever happens, it's going to happen anyway. And I don't feel strongly one way or the other because, you know, I might lose some friends. People might speak ill of me. So people usually keep their head down. And this analysis by Harris is really revealing in that it talks about how people are more likely to vote if a snap election is held. So please take a look at that because the difference between, like I said, in the last two elections for the lower house, the difference between the winner and the runner-up is so small that the winds of change can change that dynamic. If the LDP loses, it's going to be blamed on Mr. Kishida, even though it might not all be his fault. So a snap election seems somewhat distant, but you never know. The Prime Minister said this time last week, I have no intention of closing down the lower house. He looked at the numbers too. But a prime minister is always going to say that. A prime minister is never going to say, I'm going to close down the house and have an election until the day that he decides to do it. So we're going to continue to watch that. The prospects of having a snap election immediately after G7 are very small, but the Diet is in session until June. And you could have a snap election while the Diet is in session, meaning that they would call for an election towards the end of the session, or maybe even extend the session, close down the House, have an election there in late June, early July. That seems to be the most prominent time, should there be an election, but it depends on a lot of things. We're going to continue to watch that and report on that to you, but it comes up quite a bit. The Diet has been extremely busy over these last weeks, passing bills in the lower house that will go to the upper house for their vote. And if it is not passed in the upper house, it comes back down to the lower house. It is voted again. And if they vote for it one more time, which is what they almost always do, it becomes law. So the upper house is kind of like a stamp of approval. It doesn't approve everything, but normally it does. The number of votes that the LDP has in the upper house is somewhat represented in the lower house, especially with the coalition partners. So if you need 50% to pass a bill, the LDP is going to typically get their way. The GX promotion bill passed the lower house. The revised health insurance law passed the lower house. And the immigration bill passed on Tuesday as well. So all of these are revisions and tweaks to existing law. And although when we talk about the law, for example, the GX promotion bill talks about carbon credits, and companies who are producing and selling product or even services, they do have a carbon footprint as a consequence of that activity. There's a way to calculate that and to assess that. And this promotion bill puts this into a process where if you're generating a carbon footprint, you need to equalize that somehow by purchasing carbon credits from companies who are diminishing carbon. And so this carbon trading situation is going to be implemented in law. But with all of these laws, although they are passed now, between now and this time next year, April of next year, the bill doesn't go into force and effect. On the bills that are passed by the lower house and the upper house and become law this year, then the bureaucracy goes into a process of reforming and refining the regulations that implement those laws, and then they go into effect next year or the year after that, depending on what the bill says. So although we talk about it, it's anticipation and preparation for what's going to be happening in the near future. A lot of things that are going on now, for example, the age of maturity and all of these things that have happened, they happened 3 years ago and to be implemented the next year. So a lot of those things are happening as a consequence of this process. So you have to follow the process, and hopefully we can keep you abreast of that. Since COVID is over, thank you very much, everybody. There is now a reflection on what we did during COVID and how much money we spent on it. I think that same analysis is going on in the United States. But here in Japan, they have, the numbers are somewhat rough. I don't think it's actually the whole ball of wax right now. But the analysis right now is that Japan spent 94 trillion yen, which is about 701 billion US dollars over the last 3 years in terms of COVID response. And the total of the fiscal 2018 annual budget only exceeds that amount by 2 trillion yen. So what this means is that for every person in Japan, the Japanese government spent about 630,000 yen or $4,700. Every person in Japan, the Japanese government spent that money as a part of COVID response, not as a part of running the government, just as a COVID response. And they're wondering what Japan got as a consequence of that. There were 3 supplemental budgets that were passed during COVID, you might remember. The second one was a whopping one. We reported that, this was the largest supplemental budget in Japanese history. It was 31.9 trillion yen for the second one. And then this last budget that they passed was just an astounding budget. It was the largest budget that the Japanese Diet has passed in its history. So these costs just keep going up. The amount of money that is being devoted to running the economy and getting the country through COVID is being kind of evaluated now to see, what was good and what was bad. There might be some blame game coming up, but that will probably only happen after possible elections. But the amount of money spent on COVID was just even so much more than what the government spent in 2008 to address the financial crisis, almost twice as much as that. So this included not just the 10,000 yen handouts that the government did, but also keeping companies afloat. So you might remember that companies that were suffering, people that had to rather than lay off people, they sent them home and they kept their salaries up. And also the monies were available to companies so that they wouldn't go belly up during COVID. And so the Japanese government had, low interest or zero interest loans to give these companies. Now those loans are coming due. And a lot of those companies only survived because of the government handouts. And now it's coming time for them to repay the government. And it looks like a large majority of those companies will fail in the next 2 years because they just can't keep pace. The business environment has changed so drastically. They haven't moved with it. And already they were sick ghost companies to begin with in the first place. So we've talked about, and Maya promoted, a global recession, and is the recession going to come to Japan? In discussing what this briefing would consist of. And a lot of the vectors that we look at and analyze are indicating that there is a lot of pain to be coming in the summer months and towards the fall, and particularly towards this time next year. And it's not just Japan, but it's globally, but also the worrying fact with the weather conditions too. So there's a lot to be concerned about, and yeah, a lot to be watching. Thursday to Saturday in Niigata, the G7 finance ministers got together. It was a big deal. The governor, Bank of Japan governor was there. The Minister of Finance was there. Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, was there. And they talked about a lot of the global issues. The U.S. debt also came up, and it's kind of unfortunate that the United States sucks in so much oxygen from the room talking about their own personal issues when, we should be talking about G7. But the United States really, when they have a malady or an illness, it really does affect everybody else. So the fact that the president of the United States comes to G7 is very important. And all of these issues that they're discussing, they're very weighty. And the fact that there have been a couple of bank failures in the United States, many of the signals that are being massaged in Niigata this last week were to preserve a sense of calm and consistency with regard to currency, with regard to bank regulations and the strength of the banking system and the currency, the U.S. currency. And they talked about the cryptocurrency as well. There's been a lot of thought about, moving from the paper currency and the fractional reserves to a digital currency, cryptocurrency. And this has somewhat been downplayed in this last iteration. So it doesn't look like it will be touched upon in G7, but I don't know if it will get a full shakeout. But this issue of catastrophe, Janet Yellen used the word a couple of times to describe the possibility of the United States defaulting on its debt payments if the president is not successful in fixing the debt ceiling with the U.S. Congress. Something like this, if the president doesn't show up, it's only happened in recent years with Bill Clinton in 1995. You might remember during the APEC meeting forum in Osaka, same sort of situation, the debt ceiling crisis, and he was having trouble. Bill Clinton didn't come to Osaka to represent the United States, but he sent his vice president instead. So that is a precedent. Maybe one of the reasons the United States is a little bit hesitant is because the precedent is if Joe Biden doesn't come, then his vice president, Kamala Harris, would come instead. So maybe that issue died very quickly. I don't know. But it does look like now that the president will be coming. Komeito is nervous, as I said earlier. Of the 1,555 candidates that Komeito supported in this last election, in governor's race, in the municipal elections, the city races, only 12 lost. So that's a 99% success rate for Komeito. So they can bring in the votes for their candidates, but they didn't run in every race. And if they did spread themselves out a little bit thinner, they probably they definitely would have lost. But in those areas where they decided to win, they've made a combination with the LDP. They support the LDP in those areas where they don't have a good candidate, with the LDP leaving alone so that they can win in those races that they can. But it's not a very strong stance for them. And Ishin, by contrast, they started the race with 469 members in the constituency, and that went up to 774 winners. Plus, they got the Osaka mayor, they got the Osaka governor, they got all of the majority of Osaka prefectural and mayoral municipal seats. So they're on a roll. And of the 9 lower house Komeito members that are on the proportional representation list, 4 of them are in Osaka, where Ishin is very strong. So were there to be an election today, those 4 seats, or these 9 seats that Komeito has in Osaka, are really going to be at risk. So Komeito doesn't particularly want to have a lower house election. They are kind of back on their feet. The election results showed that, and they showed that Ishin is really beginning to develop it. But as far as the spread looks, Komeito has 32 seats in the lower house. Ishin has 41 seats. In the upper house, Komeito has 27 seats, and Ishin has 21 seats. So they're very close in terms of competition. The LDP, by contrast, in the upper house has 119 seats of the 248. That's in the upper house. So they don't have a majority in the upper house without their coalition in Komeito. For the lower house, it's a different gig. They do have a majority in the lower house, but in having that majority preserved in both houses, they do need Komeito or somebody like Komeito. So this dance between Komeito and Ishin is going on. Ishin has said they're not interested in a coalition. They're interested, first of all, in becoming the main opposition party. So they need to kick out the Constitutional Democratic Party, which tells you why Constitutional Democratic Party Chairman Izumi said, if we don't win, 150 seats, then I will resign. So the fight is beginning to start. The gloves are off, and people are beginning to prepare for that. Let me see what else we've got. We've got plenty more, but I think I'm going a little bit over time here. Let me see what we've got. Yeah, the Diet has passed a couple of bills. We talked about that. Also, for criminal law and the green transformation, it looks like those bills will become law. They have another law. It's not called the Carlos Ghosn bill, but it does talk about putting GPS trackers on people who have been arrested and released. You might remember Carlos Ghosn was released on bail and then escaped Japan in a outstanding kind of getaway. So in light of that, they want to have GPS trackers attached to the people who have been released from jail awaiting hearing. Finally, there are two other things I want to talk about. One is the U.S. has opened its embassy in Tonga. You might have thought, the United States is close with Tonga. Of course, they have an embassy there. Apparently, they didn't until just now. They've announced they're going to have an embassy in the capital city there. And they've had diplomatic relations with Tonga since 1972, but now they've decided to set up an embassy, which means they need to assign an ambassador there as well. The same thing with the Solomon Islands. After a 30-year absence, the United States will set up an embassy there. In Vanuatu, in Kiribati, there's also a consolidation going on there. And the Solomons announced in March that they're going to have the Chinese coming in to rebuild their port facilities. So this competition is going on in the Pacific Islands very furiously right now. The United States is moving very briskly to establish that. The United States, Japan also has a very close relation and also visits Palau, Kiribati. The imperial family has been there. The emperor has visited there because of the war dead that are there, and just a lot of the history that's there. But this onslaught of like-minded countries and this competition against China for them establishing a foothold in the Asia Pacific is going on at a furious pace. The United States wants to renew their pact with the Marshall Islands, with Palau, and the federal states of Micronesia. And as I said, when Joe Biden finishes the G7, he's going to visit Papua New Guinea. This is the first time for the President of the United States to visit Papua New Guinea. So this is going on at a furious pace. And then the final thing I want to talk about is, you remember Secretary General Motegi visited the United States last week. He had very high-level talks with Jake Sullivan, with Blinken, with many people in the State Department. He went from the United States to Cuba and then to Mexico. Much speculation is that he's burnishing his image to have a run at the Prime Minister's office. So he's, people are watching what he's doing. He's not particularly well liked within the LDP, although he has a very strong background. He was foreign minister. He was minister of METI. He was minister of economic revitalization. He was the LDP election committee chairperson. He was a policy chief. So he has done favors for people. He's collected a lot of favors, but he is a bit prickly. I don't know if he would make a great prime minister, but it looks like that is what's being set up. And remember, I said that the smallest faction in the LDP, which is the Moriyama faction, it gained a seat this last week by an independent member joining it. So the standing is still, the Seiwakai has 100 members, the Abe faction. Mr. Aso comes in at second at 55. Mr. Motegi has 54 members. Mr. Kishida is at fourth place. He has 46 members. Mr. Nikai is still strong and in the standing. He has 41 members. And Moriyama has 8 members now. And the reason why this is important is because the prime minister has indicated, or maybe there's just word going on, that should there be a snap election, there will be a change in the cabinet. And he does want to get Mr. Motegi out so he can put his good friend Moriyama in. So that signals that Moriyama will be on the upswing. And so people who are looking for a cabinet portfolio or a boost in their standing politically, maybe they're going to be gravitating to some of these factions, and that is exactly what it looks like with the Moriyama faction. So there's much more action there. As I said earlier, there is no distinct leader of the Abe faction yet, but I suspect that within the next couple of months there will be. Like I said, June 9th is the anniversary of the assassination of Prime Minister Abe, and so building up to that, in fact, using that as a critical target date, it could be, in terms of generating a sentimental vote, it could be the date that the prime minister decides to close the House. Alternatively, it could just be a key point of reference for the Abe faction to get their act together and to identify their next leader, who would definitely be a candidate for prime minister when that eventually happens. Once again, I apologize, Maya, for going over. There's just, like you said, when we started this briefing, so much going on, and I hope I've been able to encapsulate most of the important points, but if there's much more to talk about, let's do it in the Q&A.
Definitely, let's do it in the Q&A. Let's move to Clubhouse. Thank you for the briefing. A lot of useful information there, and I appreciate that. So, great. I hope that your phone is still on.
It is?
Great. Okay, so that's all for the live stream today. Thank you very much. And I'll see you in Clubhouse then.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
See you next week. So thank you very much for your patience, for watching us. This was Japan Expert Insights and the weekly Japanese Politics One-on-One with Timothy Langley, CEO of Langley Esquire, and me, Maya Matsuoka, the founder of Japan Expert Insights. We'll be here once again on Sunday morning next week at 8:20 Japan time. So if you have a little bit of time to tune in, please join us again. Thank you. See you then.